Welcome back to the next micro lecture of the module. As promised, during our time together today, we will be focusing on the expansion laws that enacted more restrictions on what could be used, how it needed to be labeled, and what would eventually become outlawed. Let's go ahead and get started. In our last lecture, we discussed the passage of the 1906 Food and Drug Act, which required labeling procedures and a list of ingredients to be posted on every bottle of medicine produced in the United States. However, the Food and Drug Act did not require a prescription for a lot of these medications, simply that you had to tell people what was in them. So at this point, there is no regulation in terms of prohibited or controlled substances like we have today. So at this point, we have no law making the distinction between what needed a prescription and what did not need a prescription, but it was not concrete and was not consistent among druggists. The Durham-Humphrey Amendment to the Food and Drug Act required that certain drugs needed a prescription and others did not. So now we have the first formalized mention of over-the-counter drugs, even though people had been buying over-the-counter drugs for years. This law was the first instance in which there was a categorization of drugs based on dependency issues. If it was habit-forming, if it should be supervised by a doctor, meaning it was not safe for self-medication, or if it was brand new, then it would need to be a prescription drug. This law also allowed for the refill of prescription medication for the first time ever. Many new drugs still fall into this categorization. If it is new, then they will require a prescription unless it was designed specifically as an over-the-counter drug. For example, take Nexium. This was a heartburn and acid reflux medication known most commonly as the purple pill. It was available by prescription only, and then after so many years, it was allowed to be sold as an over-the-counter drug if you change the formula somewhat and don't make it prescription strength. But the FDA must approve the switch from prescription to over-the-counter, meaning an RX to OTC switch. So now we're at the point where we can regulate prescriptions, but there is still not a mechanism in place where we can approve the effectiveness of the drugs. Really, we're reliant on individual doctors to make the determination as to whether or not the drug worked for an individual patient. Everything changed in the 1950s and early 1960s with the use of thalidomide. Thalidomide was only briefly used in the US, but was widely available in Europe, Canada, and Africa as a way to treat morning sickness in pregnant women. But this was a drug that was never evaluated before it was dispensed. And yes, indeed, it did help lower the symptoms of morning sickness in women. But then we had a bunch of babies that were being born with a lot of limb deformities. The limbs were not growing all the way out, and they rather looked like flippers. The drug was altering the development of the fetus in utero. Other countries are experiencing these issues, and now the drug company wants to bring it over to the US on a large scale. They begin distributing after the Richardson-Merrill received testing approval in the 1960s. This was the old testing method. We get the drug, we distribute it, and then we see what the effects are. Frances Kelsey knew what was going on in other countries, and she demanded that Richardson-Merrill provide testing results from the women who received the drug. The company refused 6 different times to provide the results. Kelsey shut down the use of thalidomide in the US, but 17 children were born with these deformities. So now people are calling on the FDA to be in charge of testing. Do not let drug companies distribute the drugs without some sort of evaluation first. This is why we have different levels of drug testing, and it takes so long to receive FDA approval for a new drug. This is a photo of a typical thalidomide baby who was born after its mother took the medication to help alleviate her morning sickness. At the time, medical professionals were unaware of the risks associated with thalidomide when they were prescribing it. It was not until babies were born with these birth defects that the pharmaceutical industries became aware of the side effects associated with the drug. This opened the doors to pharmaceutical testing of drugs with government supervision of the manufacturing. After this tragedy, the government said, "No more. You cannot just give people drugs and hope for the best. If you want to sell a drug, you will have to prove that it does what you claim. You have to clinically test it extensively and provide those results to the FDA. Then the FDA has to confirm those results. If we don't get the same results that you do, then we're not allowing you to sell the drug." The FDA now also has the right to take a drug off the market if it is causing more harm or if it's not doing what it was approved to do. Fen-phen was the largest weight loss supplement in the world for a while. It was introduced in the 1970s and started to become very popular in the 1980s. Clinical testing showed that the experiment group lost about twice as much weight as the control group. It took off and became massively popular. But then fen-phen users started having heart attacks and their heart valves were enlarging, resulting in vascular heart disease. And those who were drinking while they were using fen-phen were experiencing larger amounts of alcohol dependence. Viagra testing is another great example. It was meant to be a heart pill. Can you imagine if they never tested this pill before they started distribution? So the FDA is over here looking at prescription drugs, but sometimes over-the-counter drugs are strong enough to have some concerning properties as well. So it's time to look at everything. Now the FDA is going to evaluate those that were purposely designed as over-the-counter drugs. By looking at them, they will determine whether they are generally recognized as safe and effective. Then they will allow it to be marketed and used. It could also determine that the drug in question is not safe and effective or unacceptable indications for the outcomes of interest. In this case, they will not allow it to be marketed or used. Dependent on the drug, there have been instances in which drug companies have restructured the formula or changed the dose or whatever they needed to produce a better over-the-counter product. Finally, they could determine that there is insufficient data to permit final classification. They will not allow it to be marketed or used in this instance. However, they can allow a manufacturer to try testing it again if they want to. The FDA has an RX to OTC switch policy that allows for drug companies to distribute drugs as an over-the-counter version of the original prescription medication. After 3 years of prescription status, they can then apply for an over-the-counter status. Many drug companies choose to change the strength of the drug and have a prescription version and an over-the-counter version. Then they can make twice as many profits. It also has to be a very popular drug. If they choose to alter the product's formula or strength, the FDA must approve the switch. That may require additional testing depending on what the switch or the change is for. There also can't be a large chance for drug interactions to occur. The dosage on a lot of these over-the-counter drugs aren't as high that they could cause a severe drug interaction, but there still might be a concern. Meaning that when you take a prescription drug, you should not be concerned that your over-the-counter medication will cause a bad reaction when you take them at the same time. Again, let's turn to the example of Viagra. It's often not considered safe for self-medication and is often used by people who are a little bit older. When you're older, you're often on more medications than younger people. It is not safe to use for those individuals with heart conditions unless the heart medication is altered to account for the Viagra use. If it were an over-the-counter drug, we would have a lot of heart patients having a really good time, but who are ready to blow their hearts out. Once we have FDA approval to market a prescription or an over-the-counter drug, then the promotion of these products may begin. Drug advertising. Everywhere we see a commercial for this, that, or the other. Buy my pill, it'll help you lower your cholesterol. Or you can have sex whenever you want. Or you can help sleep better. Or do whatever you really want, really. But the advertising campaigns for these drugs are phenomenal. You can get paid celebrity endorsements, and you have all these people who are so much happier once they start taking whatever it is that we're trying to sell you. But there are 3 elements to the advertisement that are required to be in every single ad. What are the 3 necessary elements required to be in the ad? First, the advertisement must include the generic name of the drug. So the brand name has to be there, but also the actual generic name. For example, Tylenol is the brand name, but acetaminophen is the generic name of the drug. And looking at our Vicodin advertisement, you can see the generic name is listed here as hydrocodone, and it is available in a 7.5 milligram dose. The ad also must include at least 1 approved use for the drug, meaning that it lowers cholesterol, it lowers the risk of a heart attack or stroke, for example. In this case, it is clearly listed as a pain reliever, which doesn't seem too difficult to get. It is available via telephone prescription, and you can even get multiple refills. And finally, all of the risks using the drug: liver issues, muscle pain, weakness, possible drug interactions, etc. You can see here in this Vicodin advertisement that all of the side effects are in small print, so you won't pay as much attention to it. That's done purposely, but you might also notice here that it is a very small little warning that this might be habit forming. We know in hindsight that oxycodone is extremely habit forming. Part of the advertisement process is making the product appealing to consumers. So if you see this ad and figure out how easy it is to get pain relief, you can only imagine that it would be a matter of time before this became a problem, which it definitely did. Additional restrictions have been put in place regarding the advertisement of opioid-based products after the explosion of prescriptions that were being written, eventually leading to the massive opioid crisis that we see in our country today. With the end of this content in this micro lecture, we are setting the scene for what happens when substances are deemed highly habit-forming and addictive. In the last micro lecture of the module, we are going to discuss governmental regulation in terms of controlled substances, outlawed substances, and those that are still permissible to obtain. Join me back here in a moment for that discussion.